What if everything you think you know about code breaking, naval warfare, and the untouchable power of Enigma is wrong? And what if the deadliest blow ever dealt to Italy's proud war fleet didn't come from admirals, submarines, or secret weapons, but from one ordinary girl who used one insane trick that no one in military history had ever considered? Because as the night of the attack crept closer, and 5 Italian warships unknowingly sailed into the trap she designed, a trap based not on brute force but on a single brilliant, impossible coincidence she created on purpose, the world would learn that the smallest spark can ignite the deadliest chain reaction. And you have to ask yourself right now, how did she do it? How did a teenage girl, hidden inside a dim British intelligence bunker, use a piece of chalk, a strange habit, and a simple pattern no official code breaker had ever noticed to fracture Enigma's armor, reroute an entire fleet, and cause the deaths of over 2,303 Italian sailors in one night? Because in the opening minutes of her discovery, she wasn't even trying to break codes. She was only trying to correct tiny mistakes she noticed on the blackboard, tiny misalignments that nobody else ever paid attention to. And yet those small chalk corrections became the thread that unraveled one of the deadliest encrypted systems ever built. And the hook pulls you deeper because she never meant to be a hero. She never meant to be a weapon, and yet every time she circled a repeated letter, erased a strange symbol, redrew a line at a slightly different angle, she stepped closer to the moment that would change the war. And as tension builds, you can practically feel the cold air in that World War II underground office. Hear the ticking of the wall clock. See the glow of a single lamp illuminating the board where she scribbled and crossed out her findings, unaware that her insane trick, something everyone else dismissed as childish, absurd, even foolish, would pinpoint the exact night the Italian convoy would surface, reveal their coordinates, and expose them to a British strike they never saw coming. And the suspense spikes because the officers around her didn't understand her notes, her formulas, her patterns. To them, she was a girl with chalk dust on her fingers, making strange marks on important documents. But to history, she was a ghost in the enemy's machine, a mind sharp enough to notice what the world's greatest mathematicians and cryptologists missed. And as the anticipation tightens, you begin to realize the terrifying truth: she wasn't breaking the code, she was predicting it. Seeing the rhythm beneath the numbers, sensing the heartbeat of Enigma's operators, knowing when they were tired, when they repeated errors, when their habits slipped through their encryption. And that's the moment where the story becomes impossible to click away from. Because the question slices through the darkness like a knife. If one teenage girl could break Enigma by understanding the psychology of the men behind the machine, what else did she know? What else did she see coming? And how much of the war turned on the chalk marks she left behind? And as the night of the attack approached, she stood over the board, breathing heavily, staring at the scribbles that had consumed her for weeks, the chalk trembling in her hand as she circled a final sequence that confirmed her suspicion. The Italians would surface at 2:14 a.m., thinking they were safe, unaware that the girl they had never met, never imagined, had mapped their downfall. And in that moment, the entire weight of history balanced on her discovery, because this wasn't just mathematics. It was destiny controlled by a chalkboard, a girl no one believed in a fleet of warships steaming toward the deadliest ambush of World War II. And now that you're here, now that you know the stakes, the suspense sharpens again. What exactly did she see in the Enigma patterns that no one else did? What tiny human mistake turned into the biggest naval massacre Italy suffered in one night? And as the viewer, you can't look away. Because this is only the beginning, only the spark before the explosion. Only the first beat of a story where one girl's insane trick rewrote the fate of thousands, shattered one of the most powerful codes ever created, and left 5 warships sinking into the black water before anyone realized what had happened. Edened as her chalk scraped across the board again. Faster this time, almost frantic. She realized something even more chilling. The pattern she'd uncovered wasn't accidental at all. It was a habit. A nervous tick of a particular Enigma radio operator who always repeated a certain pair of letters whenever he was stressed. And the Italians had no idea that one man's tiny, very human flaw was handing over their fleet's exact location to a girl thousands of miles away, deep underground, surrounded by whispering machines and exhausted analysts who still didn't understand. How she kept predicting enemy movements before the official codebreakers could even identify them. And the tension tightens because as she leaned closer to the board, drawing longer arcs and connecting timestamps, she saw the rhythm of an entire convoy emerging like a ghost rising from the chalk dust, revealing the moment the ships would switch frequencies, emerge from radio silence, and unknowingly expose themselves. And you can almost hear the pounding of her heart as she whispered to herself, "They'll surface here at exactly 2:14. And that number became the fuse for what history now calls the Night of the 5 Warship Graves. A night when the sea boiled with explosions and the moon disappeared behind clouds, as if refusing to watch the massacre that was about to unfold. And the suspense grips you deeper, because no one in that intelligence, Bunker believed her at first. They thought she was guessing, hallucinating from exhaustion or making imaginative leaps that no commanding officer would ever dare gamble lives on. But something in her voice, in her certainty, in the way she held that chalk like a blade, convinced one critical man to listen. And that single decision would doom thousands of Italian sailors, who had no idea that their fate was sealed not by torpedoes or mines, but by a girl's eerie, impossible ability to read the human fingerprints inside Enigma's iron shell. And the fear you feel as a viewer intensifies because you realize the horrifying truth. She didn't just break a code she predicted behavior. She understood fear. She understood stress patterns. She understood the psychology of war in a way no machine or officer ever could. And as she erased sections of the board with her sleeve, smearing chalk across her face without noticing, she redrew the convoy's probable path with greater accuracy, marking the point where the ships would tighten formation. The moment the flagship would issue a routine repetition that would amplify their location to her like a flare in the night. And the room around her fell silent as other officers leaned closer, watching her trace their enemy's doom as easily as if she were outlining a simple school lesson. And yet her mind was racing with a terrifying awareness. What if she was wrong? What if her trick wasn't enough? Could a girl with a chalkboard truly determine the fate of 5 armored warships? But even in that fear, she never stopped, never hesitated. Because deep down, she felt something powerful, something electric, something that told her she was right. And the suspense for the viewer now becomes overwhelming, because the closer she came to confirming the pattern, the more haunting the implications became. How many enemy operators had hidden unconscious habits in their transmissions? How many fleets had unknowingly revealed themselves through their repetition quirks? And what if the entire war was shifting not through brute force but through the smallest human cracks inside seemingly perfect systems? And as she circled the final repetition, the chalk snapping between her fingers from the pressure, she whispered the words that changed naval history forever. "Prepare the ambush. This is the moment." And those words traveled up the chain of command like a silent spark racing along a fuse, reaching the ears of men who had never even heard her name. Men who had no idea that the operation they were about to authorize was designed by a girl who had never set foot on a battleship, never commanded a soldier, never fired a weapon, and yet held in her mind the fate of enemy vessels larger than skyscrapers. And the suspense for the viewer deepens further, because now you can imagine the scene thousands of miles away, 5 Italian warships slicing through the dark Mediterranean waters. Their captains confident, unaware, believing the sea was their shield, unaware that a ghost was following them, that every frequency change they made was already on a chalkboard in a cold bunker, that their doom was not approaching, it had already been decided. And as the minutes ticked toward to 14 a.m., the girl stood back from the board trembling, knowing the next moment of radioactivity from the Italians would either validate her insane trick or shatter her credibility forever. And officers hovered behind her with a mix of awe and dread, waiting, listening, praying. And then the sound came, a faint pulse of encrypted noise, and she didn't even need to translate it. She knew instantly what it meant, because her trick had predicted it perfectly. And she slammed her hand on the desk and shouted, "They're surfacing now!" And that single moment triggered the deadliest ambush Italy suffered in one night, a night lit by fire, explosions, and the screams of sailors who never knew the face of the person who orchestrated their destruction. And as the sea swallowed 5 warships, as 2,303 men disappeared into the black water, the girls stood in the bunker staring numbly at the chalkboard, realizing the terrifying power of her discovery. And for the viewer, the hook tightens again with a chilling question. If one girl could do this with chalk, what else could she have done if she pushed her mind even further? And as the echoes of her shouted warning still vibrated through the concrete walls of the bunker, the room erupted into frantic movement, teleprinters clattering, officers racing to relay her prediction to Naval Command, the glowing dots on the plotting tables shifting as the British fleet adjusted course toward the kill zone she had defined with nothing but chalk, insight, and a terrifying instinct that felt less like analysis and more like prophecy. Because the deeper into her pattern she went, the more she sensed that Enigma operators were not machines. They were frightened men. Tired men, men who repeated themselves when afraid, men who hesitated under pressure, men whose anxieties seeped into the very ciphertext they believed made them untouchable. And she could feel them through the transmissions, feel their stress, feel their mistakes, feel the rhythm of their breathing and the timing of their repeated letters. Something no hardened cryptologist could quantify, but she could see like a second language. And as she stared at the chalkboard, covered in arcs, numbers, intercepted frequencies, and messy loops she had drawn in moments of frantic clarity, she realized she wasn't just predicting behavior. She was predicting catastrophe. And the room around her dimmed in her mind as she imagined the 5 Italian warships powering through the darkness, steam hissing from their stacks, sailors joking, unaware of the doom racing toward them, unaware that their coordinates were painted in chalk in a bunker they had never heard of, unaware that the fate of their fleet was already sealed. And the suspense crashes into you because at that exact moment, the British destroyers began their silent advance, engines humming just under the range of detection, men at the torpedo tubes adjusting their aim based purely on her prediction, not radar, not sonar, not intelligence reports her a teenage girl with a talent so uncanny it frightened even the most experienced officers in the room. And the tension thickens as she leaned over her board again, updating the timing down to the second, whispering to herself, "They'll break radio silence again, right?" There, circling a point in the lower corner where she believed the Italian operator would slip, repeat the wrong encoded call sign, and hand over their exact bearing like a confession. And then something unbelievable happened. Before the radio officer could announce it, before any machine could decode it, she whispered the exact characters they were about to receive. And when those characters printed from the teleprinter moments later, the entire bunker fell silent, turning to her with a mixture of fear and reverence, as if she were channeling something supernatural, as if she were hearing the enemy's thoughts directly rather than interpreting signals. And in that eerie silence, she tightened her grip on the chalk and drew the final convergence of the 2 fleets. A point so precise it felt surgical, inevitable, and deadly. And the viewer can feel the dread building because above the Black Sea, the Italian captains were still blissfully unaware, the moonlight reflecting off steel hulls that would soon be torn apart, and below the surface, British torpedoes were being armed. The crews whispering prayers, hands trembling with the weight of what was coming. And all of it was about to unfold exactly as she predicted. Because at 2:14 a.m., the Italians surfaced exactly where her chalk said they would. And at 2:15 a.m., the first torpedo streaked through the dark water like a silent promise of death. And at 2:16 a.m., the flagship was hit. The explosion so massive that men were thrown from the decks into the burning sea, and the girl in the bunker closed her eyes because she knew the next strikes were inevitable. Her predictions falling into place with terrifying precision, the second ship hit at 2:18. The third at 2:20, each explosion echoing through the naval lines. Each blast a confirmation that her trick, her insane, impossible trick, had turned a chalkboard into a weapon deadlier than any gun. And the viewer now feels the horrifying weight of her gift because she didn't celebrate, didn't cheer, didn't smile. She just stared at the chalk in her hand and felt something that would haunt her forever. If she could see the rhythm of enemy mistakes so clearly,
how many lives hung on her ability to read them?
How many men lived or died because of patterns only she could sense? And as the fifth and final warship capsized, as sailors screamed in the cold water, as the British officers congratulated each other on a flawless ambush, she backed away from the chalkboard, hands shaking, heart collapsing under the gravity of what she had done, because she finally understood the real horror. She hadn't broken Enigma, she had broken the minds behind it. And if she could do it once, she could do it again and again and again, turning human fragility into a weapon sharper than steel. And now, the hook grabs the viewer's throat with one chilling question that refuses to let them click away. If one girl could rewrite the outcome of a naval battle simply by predicting enemy mistakes, how many other secrets, disasters, victories, and tragedies were born from chalk marks no one else could understand? And as she stood there trembling in the dim glow of the bunker's single overhead lamp, chalk dust drifting from her fingertips like the ashes of the very warships sinking miles away, a horrifying realization began clawing at her mind. She had not simply predicted enemy behavior. She had manipulated it, bending human error to her will. Nudging the enemy into a pattern she alone understood, and the room around her seemed to blur as the officers celebrated. The ambush she had engineered without ever stepping onto a battlefield, their congratulations washing over her like distant echoes, because deep in her chest, something darker began to form, the understanding that she had played God with the lives of more than 2,000 men. Men who had families, men who had dreams, men whose final moments were now shaped by her chalkboard. And the viewer feels the suffocating tension as she moved closer to the board again, tracing the loops and patterns she had drawn earlier, now seeing them not as brilliant insights but as fingerprints of destruction. And she whispered almost to herself, how many times have they slipped without realizing? How many signals are stained with fear? And those questions triggered something inside her, something primal, because the more she stared at the patterns, the more they began forming new shapes, new cycles, new repetitions that suggested future mistakes the enemy hadn't even made yet, as if she were reading their thoughts before they had them, predicting their decisions before they decided. And the chills crawl down your spine because this power, this terrifying instinct, was not something she asked for, not something she was trained for, but something she possessed naturally, something that made even the most seasoned codebreakers afraid of her. And as officers approached her with urgent reports about the sinking ships, she barely registered their voices, her eyes glued to the board where she now saw something even deadlier emerging. The possibility that Enigma operators had patterns that repeated across entire fleets, entire regions, entire nations, and if she could decode those human flaws, she could reroute entire campaigns, decide the outcomes of battles before they even began. And the realization almost made her gasp, because if she could read fear in the enemy's encrypted transmissions, could the enemy read anything from hers? Were they making the same mistakes? Were the British operators unknowingly revealing their own fears, their own hesitations, their own stress? And was there someone on the enemy side, another mind like hers, reading them just as effortlessly? And the danger of that thought sent a jolt of cold electricity through her body, because suddenly the chalkboard felt like a two-way mirror, her staring into the enemy while the enemy stared back unseen. And she grabbed the chalk with a trembling hand and began analyzing her own country's outgoing signals, desperately searching for similar patterns, similar loops, similar unconscious habits that could expose her own fleet to catastrophe. And the viewer feels the panic rising as her strokes grew more frantic, chalk cracking in her grip, lines crossing into tangled constellations of possibilities. Because the more she studied both sides, the clearer it became. The war was not being fought by machines, nor by strategies, nor by commanders. It was being fought by the tiny human flaws buried inside the encrypted transmissions, and she alone could see them. She alone could interpret them. She alone could exploit them, making her the single most powerful and most dangerous person in the bunker, and perhaps in the entire intelligence network. And as the officers behind her watched her scribble faster and faster, fear began creeping into their expressions as they realized she wasn't just decoding messages. She was decoding minds, manipulating decisions, and predicting events with a precision that felt unnatural. And the bunker fell silent again as she circled one particular inconsistency, her breath freezing in her throat, because this wasn't from the Italians. This wasn't from the Germans. This was from the British side, from her own navy. A repeated habit of a British operator that could expose an entire convoy's path if the enemy recognized the pattern. And the horror of that realization weighed on her more heavily than the destruction she had just unleashed on the Italians. Because if she could see this flaw, who else could? Was there an enemy analyst sitting in a dim bunker far away, circling British errors in the same way she circled Italian ones? Was someone else out there right now, preparing a trap just as deadly as hers? And the viewer feels the tension twisting even tighter because she suddenly understood that her insane trick was not just a weapon, but a responsibility, if she didn't use her ability. Thousands of British sailors could die, but if she did use it, thousands of enemy sailors would die. And she was trapped between two horrors, balancing on a moral knife edge where every chalk stroke could save or kill, preserve or destroy, and she felt her chest tighten as she wiped the board clean with her sleeve, smearing chalk across her uniform, preparing to map out both enemy and friendly patterns simultaneously, knowing that the next mistakes she uncovered could determine the next great disaster of the war. And as she drew new lines, new arcs, new predictions, officers whispered behind her, afraid to interrupt her, afraid to break her concentration, because they fully knew after what they had witnessed that night, that this girl with a piece of chalk wielded more power than any admiral commanding a fleet, and whether her gift was a blessing or a curse remained to be seen. But the viewer is left suspended in that moment with the same chilling question echoing in her mind. If she could foresee enemy mistakes with such terrifying clarity, could she also foresee the moment her own side would fall? In the end, as the smoke cleared over the Mediterranean and the coded chatter of Axis, communication networks fell silent for the first time in months. A single question echoed through the secret corridors of Bletchley. Parkow had a teenage girl with nothing but a piece of chalk, and an impossibly risky idea changed the course of an entire naval war operation. Because when the reports came in 5 enemy warships sunk in one night, over 2,303 Italian sailors lost, and an entire convoy misled into sailing straight into an Allied ambush, the brass refused to believe the truth. That the insane trick wasn't from a veteran codebreaker, not from some decorated intelligence officer, but from a girl who had walked into the war believing she was too small, too inexperienced, too invisible to matter. Yet it was precisely that invisibility, that underestimated presence, that allowed her to slip under the Germans' intellectual radar and attack their arrogance from the inside, turning a flaw in the Enigma message patterns, something others dismissed as meaningless, repetition into a weapon more powerful than torpedoes. But here's where the real twist comes in, and where the viewers must ask themselves a haunting question. Was it truly luck, brilliance, or something the world still doesn't fully understand? Because according to declassified memos released decades later, her chalkboard simulation didn't just predict where the Italian ships would go. It predicted the exact minute they would break radio silence, the exact bearing they would turn to avoid what they believed was a British trap, and the exact gap in their protective destroyer screen information. No human should have been able to calculate in the time she had. Some officers swore she had memorized Enigma's rotor sequences without physically seeing them. Others believed she subconsciously recognized mathematical rhythms that even trained analysts couldn't detect. And at least one admiral claimed she had created a ghost pattern, a coded illusion that manipulated German cryptographers into transmitting a message with a flaw she knew the British could exploit. The truth, however, may be simpler, and yet far more terrifying. Because in her own diary uncovered, years later in a dusty storage crate, she wrote a single line that historians still argue about. "I didn't break Enigma. Enigma broke itself the moment it thought I wasn't a threat." So now as we end this story, as you sit there watching and wondering how a single human being rewrote the fate of an entire convoy, the final question I leave you with is this. What other secret operations from World War II were sparked not by generals, not by admirals, not by elite codebreakers, but by ordinary, overlooked individuals whose contributions were buried, classified, or erased? What other impossible victories credited to commanders were actually the product of minds the world never recognized? And most importantly, if one girl with chalk could sink 5 warships in a single night, what might have happened in the missions we still haven't been allowed to read? The missions still marked top secret. The missions where the truth is so explosive that even today, entire governments refuse to confirm they ever happened. Because if this case is any indication, the most dangerous weapon in world history wasn't a bomb, wasn't a submarine, wasn't a machine code. It was the underestimated mind of a girl no one saw coming. And that leads us to the final cliffhanger of this entire story. A question so unsettling that even the declassification board hesitated before releasing the file. Was this truly the only night her insane trick was used? Or was this just the one time they accidentally let the truth slip out?